Hi, this is Rob Sheen with the Source Conference, and I'm here with Masha Sedova, who is the co-founder of Elevate. And she's going to be speaking at Source Boston on May 9th and 10th, and she's actually keynoting. And her talk is titled Using Behavioral Science to Secure Your Organization, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but it sounds like a good topic. And Masha, tell us a little bit about your talk.
So first of all, I'm really excited to participate in this conference. I've spoken at a couple of Source conferences, and I've had a chance to participate in a few more, and they've all been such a great experience. And I'm really excited and looking forward to this one as well. So wanted to say thanks so much for having me participate. The topic that I'm speaking about is one that's very near and dear to my heart. And what it's a look at is a different perspective, a different framework at addressing security awareness, as we've traditionally been calling it, in organizations. And as any security practitioner might know, we haven't done a great job at securing the human element. So what I'm talking about is considering a new framework, a new approach using behavioral science that can consider a different way for us to secure our organizations and specifically the human element of them.
Cool. So in your description, you kind of mentioned that the way we've traditionally done security awareness, and I'm familiar with this myself because I used to do security awareness programs myself, is we base it on the assumption employees just don't know what to do, and that we just need to tell them what to do, and then they'll be good. But clearly that's not worked, or at least not worked as well as we'd like. It works with some people, but it clearly doesn't work with everybody. So do you think that's a bad assumption? Because I know that you do think that's a bad assumption.
Yeah, so I mean, the data shows us that it's a bad assumption. There's some really other interesting use cases around exactly this thing. Like many people know that security training tells you to not install passwords. Not reuse passwords across different sites. And yet people do it all the time. People know how to secure a password, and people know they shouldn't reuse it, and yet they still don't do it. The gap here is ultimately the fact that it's a hard thing to do, to remember 40 unique secure passwords. So this way we need to use the function of technology to make it easier to do. Mm-hmm. Another example, for example, is smoking. A lot of people know smoking is bad for them, it might kill them, and yet they still do it, right? So knowing and awareness isn't enough. It's an important step, but it isn't the full journey.
Okay. So I know you kind of lead from there into the topic of motivation. So if really it's about motivating people to do the right thing, how do you motivate people to do security?
Yeah. So there's two parts to it. It's not just motivation. So habit change actually has two functions to it. It is increasing motivation for people and making it easier to do. And interestingly enough, those two elements have an inverse relationship to each other. The harder something is to do, the higher the motivation you need to do it.
Right.
The easier something is to do, the lower the motivation is. So when we talk about, okay, you need to increase motivation, that is only in the use case where you can't make something easier to do. So that set aside, if you want to take a look at motivation, there's a couple of ways you can absolutely do this. There is leveraging organizational motivation, so things, events that happen in organizations and as they unfold. So things like pen tests or recovering from a breach or upcoming audits can all be leveraged to drive motivation to do large organizational overhauls. But if you take a look at it at an individual level, on a personal level, individuals can be motivated to do security if you can tie it to things that they already care about. So things like competition or altruism, status or recognition or a sense of accomplishment. So things like a thank you email, a badge, a leaderboard are all elements and ways where you can leverage intrinsic motivation that we as humans already have and tie it to a security outcome.
Cool. That's interesting on the changing behaviors. It's actually motivation plus making it easier. On that topic, on the password topic, I've been fascinated by passwords for a very long time. I worked on that whole problem set before, and I actually no longer understand why anybody remembers more than one or two passwords at all, because we have password managers now, and they're actually pretty good. And I now have one really long password that I remember that unlocks all my other ones. And when people complain about, it's hard to have to, reset them, it's like, no, it isn't. You go on your password manager and say, give me a password. I don't even know what my passwords are anymore. It's like gotten
Mm-hmm.
so easy. It's like in 2018, I must have 50 or 60 or 70 passwords easily. I have to count them, but it's at least in that range.
Mm-hmm.
For all the different systems I have access to, I don't know how anybody could manage that anymore. So,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Uh, and to
it's
that
just
point,
interesting.
before password managers, the only people who had those password practices were people who were super dedicated and motivated. So
Right.
either security professionals or people who had been hacked before and said, "I'm never going to do that again."
Hmm.
Right? So that you had high motivation because it was really hard to do.
Right.
But now you don't need to be that motivated because you're just like install a tool and run with it. You have the
Super easy
same
now.
outcome and now it's super easy.
Right.
So there is this really beautiful balance between those two, and we need to just think about sort of what is the behavioral outcome we want from our employees, and looking at that from an outcome-based perspective and saying, well, how do we get there? Why are people not doing it now? Do they not
Right.
care? Do they not have the ability to do it? Do they not know? Are they not being given feedback about their progress?
Right.
So being able to apply more than just an awareness, like in training, because people might know, they just might not do it for many, many other
Hmm.
reasons.
Right. I mean, I can tell from recently when I've done presentations and trainings, on the password problem specifically, people bring it up. I'm like, why aren't you using a password manager? And sometimes they don't know. Sometimes it's
Hmm.
because, oh, well, at our company, we have a particular policy about software and yada, yada, yada. So sometimes it's that the management's not giving them the right tools to do their job properly.
Hmm.
But there's a fair number of people that still don't know. There are a lot of people that never got on the security bus with us back in the late 90s and early 2000s,
Hmm.
and we're still got to catch them up as well. So
Hmm.
there's some element of raising that awareness and teaching people the right things. But I think you're right, though. I think there's definitely that balancing act between making it easy enough so that you don't have to have them be super motivated, because the average person's just not, right?
Right.
They just they're like, my job is business analyst, or my job is sales or whatever. They don't care about security really, except that it's this annoying thing that people make them do.
Yeah, but that's actually not an unrealistic expectation.
Right.
We can't ask the rest of our organizations to be security experts. Otherwise, they would be on the security team. They don't
Hmm.
ask us to be sales or marketing or development experts. So it's unfair for us to ask them to do their job in addition to being a security expert, right? And then add a security expertise on top of it. So we need to
Hmm.
figure out what is the bare minimum that they do need to care about, and give them those tools to do it. And we really need to be thinking about positive incentives and recognition when people do the correct thing, instead of just punishing them when they do the wrong thing. Recognizing that they are going above and beyond their scope of job duties when they do, let's say, report suspicious activity. Thank you. Here's a leaderboard. You saved the organization.
Right.
There's many ways that we need to be communicating with our employees that have a positive spin on it. And as an industry, we aren't doing a good job at it yet.
Awesome. So how do we know that we're succeeding or not? Like, what metrics should we be looking at, and how do we measure, over time, are we getting any better at this or worse, or just
Hmm.
kind of running on a treadmill?
Hmm. Yeah. So it depends on what you define this is. And that's totally different for every organization.
Hmm.
When I go in and start working with different organizations, I ask them, if you had a magic wand and you waved it, what would people do differently tomorrow than they do today?
Mm.
And you can't answer they would be smarter. That's not measurable. Or they would be less dumb, or they would make less security mistakes.
Hmm.
None of those are measurable behavioral outcomes. Well, not even say I want more people to take a training. That's not different, right? That's a metric that doesn't actually show impact in the direction you want to go. What I want people to have clarity on is, when I have this amazing, outstanding program, I want my phishing to reduce to below 5% click rate for every test, regardless of test.
Mm.
I want every difficult phishing test to have at least a 20% reporting rate. I want badge surfing to be reduced to no more than 3 incidents a week. And you can start seeing that you have measurable outcomes that you're trying to drive towards, and you can see whether or not you've succeeded. And you need to break down what it means for your organization to have a security mindset, which is absolutely an umbrella goal, but the
Hmm.
measurable and the observable behaviors that fall into and that are is work required by the security team to figure out, what does success look like. And you can absolutely measure it as a function of what a user does on their laptops, or on the network, or with their badges and
Hmm.
tailgating. Um, but it really depends on what you care about for your organization.
Right. Cool. So a lot of people I hear say, why bother with end user training at all? Because it only takes one person to screw it up. And I have my own opinions on that. I'm curious to hear, what your take is on that.
Mhm.
Should we even bother with end user training? What are the real goals behind it in order to justify doing it?
hmm So if you have a technology control that fails once, should we even bother installing it in the first place? That spam filter, if you let one in, that's whatever, right? No, we don't. We don't apply that same logic to our technology and our processes. If it fails once, we just give it up. We don't. So organizations that have security-minded employees are fighting with a whole tool set that organizations without that are not. And I'm not saying that any one solution is perfect, not your technology, not your processes, and not your people. But if you choose to not invest in your people, you aren't fighting with a third of your tool set against the ongoing landscape of developing attacks. And so organizations that have security-minded employees have the benefit of being harder to hack. You're statistically going to be trickier to get an employee to click on a phishing link. I'm not saying that's not possible, but it absolutely is going to be harder. And so if you look at the economics of an attack, I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to go after an easier target if my custom malware has a less chance of being identified and reported to a security team at company B that doesn't invest in awareness versus company A that has a whole set of paranoid employees.
Right.
And the second point that I want to point out here is if you invest in reporting as your behavior, it only takes one employee to forward your custom developed malware that you've spent months developing as an attacker to the incident response team, who can then profile it, quarantine it, and
Mm.
now you're stuck, right? That's a lot of R&D time that is now gone out the window. So what you're essentially doing is you're leveling the odds. You get one person to report, and it's just as painful as one for the attacker as one person in your organization clicking.
That's a really interesting mindset shift around that. I like that perspective a lot because being able to train the idea systems is pretty useful, and having your entire company be, part of the sleuthing team for that is actually a pretty good way to look at it. So that's actually probably one of the best justifications I've heard so far for doing it. So that's awesome. Um, so you actually have a pretty deep background in awareness and awareness programs. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about that so people know what your background is?
Yeah, so I started in a much more of a traditional security background. That's what I ended up studying in college. I did computer forensics. Um, Along the way, though, I became fascinated with the question of what would it look like for people to want to do security instead of have to. And I had the opportunity of starting a team at Salesforce. Initially, it started with insider threat work. And I was like, well, I'll just investigate people, right? And that doesn't work when your company has a value of Ohana, which means family, right? And
Hmm.
and it was just the concept of an insider threat program was an antithesis to the core cultures
Hmm.
and values of the organization. So I really needed to figure out a different approach. And I said, what if people cared about security so much in their organization that they would go out of their way to report things that were abnormal?
Hmm.
Which is where I started becoming obsessed with this question. And I looked at all the tools that I had available to me, and it was compliance-based animated PowerPoints that were people people would check a quiz box at the end. I said, well, that's not going to get me to the outcome I want, where people can go above and beyond to detect like insider threats. Like that's not going to match the thing that I need. So I started doing tons of research around other industries that have totally figured out how to deal with human beings and how to get them to change their behaviors and get buy-in. And this has led me to the field of behavioral science, positive psychology, game theory, and game design. And those three, and there's several key books that were very influential in my work. And I started partnering with a couple of really awesome behavioral scientists to create frameworks for these programs. So I started applying this and rolling out these programs at scale to the 25,000 employees at Salesforce at the time. plus some of our customers, plus developers. And so I had this incredible test bed to try out some of these frameworks. And I've learned a lot of things that worked, a couple of things that don't. And I've leveraged a lot of my knowledge into what is now Elevate Security, my own company.
That's awesome. That's a great story. So definitely looking forward to seeing you at Source, and thanks for participating once again. And I love having folks like yourself come to the conference because then you get to hang out and interact with all the people that show up, and so we get to continue the conversation there. So for anybody that's interested in continuing the conversation on awareness with Masha or myself, we'll see you in Source Boston on May 9th and 10th coming up pretty soon. So hope to see you all soon, and talk to you later.
See you soon.
Bye.